Hello and welcome to AXSChat. We're delighted to be joined today by Elaine Katz from the Kessler Foundation. It's been quite some time since we last welcomed Elaine here. In fact, I think I was in the middle of the desert last time, which was quite some years ago. So Elaine, welcome back. For those of us that didn't catch us then, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a bit about the Kessler Foundation, because it does amazing work in the US, but for our audience outside of the US, it'd be good for them to know all about the foundation.
Yeah, so it's great to be back on AXSChat. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. The work at Kessler Foundation changes the lives of people with disabilities through rehabilitation funding, and also through funding employment initiatives for people with disabilities. We actually do have a lot of research collaborations throughout the world, in the EU, as well as, really all over the world. Our rehabilitation research that we do seeks to improve cognition and mobility for individuals with disabilities such as stroke, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis. We also look to improve daily functioning and independence by testing new interventions and gathering data that can be learned in treatment. I oversee our Center for Grant Making, which over the past 13 years has invested more than $49 million, both in New Jersey and throughout the US, on employment initiatives to increase the participation rates of people with disabilities. We've done pilots. We really focus on innovation. That's what we're looking to do. And we want to do, hopefully our pilots will improve processes that can change policy both in the US and elsewhere. So that's kind of a short little synopsis on what we do.
Fantastic work, and I'm always interested in organizations that change policy, because that's real impact. Quite often there is this chicken and egg situation where you have everyone's waiting for the law to change in order for stuff to happen. So I think it's organizations like Kessler that are putting money into things that can catalyze that change that are really important.
Well, that's really interesting, because when we talk about innovation, we're not, and employment, we're not talking about creating something totally new that could have a patent, or it's really taking what's out there, to your point, and using all those pieces, whether it's the laws of a particular country, what a company may be doing, looking for those best practices that are out there that can improve employment outcomes, wrapping them together and twisting them and turning them in a whole new way that can then bring it to a different level for impact.
That makes sense. A lot of the time, there's really good work going on, and it's how do we bring it together? How do we synthesize the best practice? How do we connect stuff up? How do we bring all of this under sort of the bigger tent to make it happen? Requires coordination, and sometimes that fails to happen. So having organizations engaged in doing this is really important. So how did Kessler Foundation come about and find this role?
That's a really interesting question. So I think it's almost just pretty close to 19 years ago. We were part of a large rehabilitation hospital. If you remember from the movie Superman, Christopher Reeve, he was treated at Kessler Institute, which is a very large rehab hospital in the US based in New Jersey. And at that time, they decided to sell the hospital, but there was really no buyer. And the assets, and I'll fast forward for you, all became part of Kessler Foundation that actually was running the hospital with a holding company at a point in time. And then there finally was a buyer. And when there's a buyer in the US for a company that is not for profit, you cannot spend that money. It has to go into another not-for-profit organization. So we became Kessler Foundation with a large asset base, and we absorbed the research arm in the hospital. And at that point, we decided we wanted to not only do research, but we wanted to support the community of disability in some way through grant making. And we looked at really housing, we looked at healthcare, and we looked at employment. And our asset base is not billions of dollars, it was only millions of dollars. And what can you do with millions of dollars? And really our grant making budget is only, now it's about 1.5 million a year. So it fluctuates between $1 million and $2.5 million, depending on, assets. And so the real question is what impact do we have? And we decided with employment, we would have that impact. And I was actually charged with starting a program from scratch, which is always a fun thing to do if any of you out there have been starting new programs. It's really great. You can frame it any way you like. And we did some research on the best practices of philanthropy out there. And we started locally with giving out grants to community organizations or NGOs. And then we looked nationally for innovative, and we expanded nationally, have done grants to universities and to governments and NGOs, large NGOs, with our innovation projects.
Excellent. And I was smiling when you said, well, what can you do with a couple of $1 million? Well, quite a lot.
But it's a drop in the bucket for these large issues, though. I mean,
yes,
it seems like a lot of money, but when you start to put it into some sort of initiative, it gets chewed up pretty quickly.
Oh, yes, I'm being slightly facetious. I was thinking of all the toys I could buy, but yes, I know, because as soon as you start paying people salaries and so on, and these initiatives do require people to be paid, or at least things to be paid for, the money does evaporate quite quickly. So, but I'm glad that you're getting bangs for your buck. So what are some of the standout initiatives that have where you've put some money in and got a really great return on that social investment?
Well, we've got some great social investment from the mayor's office so everybody is familiar with New York City throughout the world, which is probably a good example. And we were asked to come in on a project for the mayor's office for people with disabilities. They decided, as a city office for disability, they had a lot of clout and they had a lot of connections to start a massive employment program, not only to work in New York City government, but also to work with companies that were based in New York. And that project has really just ended, but it was a 3-year project. There was 4 or 5 foundations that ended up contributing to the support of that. And it was, again, to your point, Neil, it was to hire staff to work in that office to facilitate employment, whether it was training, development of jobs, going out and educating employers. They already had a small business group of companies that worked with the city, so it was to expand that group. And the best impact that we can see on that so far is that the city picked up 3 positions in the budget from this grant. And now there are other cities in the US that are looking to this project as a model and talking with New York City in order to expand that project. So, I mean, that would be a very large social impact project if you wanted to think about that. We talked earlier that we're in the middle of COVID. And I think COVID has provided a lot of challenges for people with disabilities, but it's provided even more challenges throughout the world for NGOs serving a population that now has growing needs, and resources have shrunk. And what we've seen in the US, at least, is because of a lot of government concern over people, local government, funneling money into people with just some of the preparations they needed to do for COVID, that a lot of the traditional referrals coming for government for services and then being able to bill the government as reimbursement has really kind of slowed down or gone to pretty much nothing in a lot of the states here. So last spring, Kessler Foundation decided to transfer all our projects and grant making that were on the table to only COVID funding. So we put $1 million into local COVID funding, and surprisingly, most of it went to technology. We found, and this now has been seen throughout a lot of reports throughout the US and the world. Not only did people with disabilities lack technology and needed to be brought up to speed, but the organizations and agencies, the NGOs that serve that group of people, their own staff were behind in learning technology. So it was providing technology that went out to the public, so to speak, but also went to staff and organizations. That was the bulk of what we were paying for. And in addition to protective equipment and emergency planning and food supplies and things like that. But I think what we saw is with COVID is the whole technical divide really got blown up. I mean, everybody talked about it before, that underserved populations around the world really were not involved in technology. And we found with everybody working remote, service delivery being remote, it just blew that open. And it also opened tech companies did really well over the past year, and it really showed that there is a need for technology that's only going to increase. And what does that mean for training and people who are looking at jobs? One of the other points that came across is that, at least in the US, there's something called looking at skills now. And it started before COVID and really during COVID and after COVID. So, companies trying to look at what are you able to do, not necessarily what level of schooling you're at. Did you go to college? Did you go to university? Do you have some sort of training? But, if you're in coding and you understand coding, what's your ability in coding? It doesn't matter if you've had a background in that. And companies, and it's been on the news here a lot too, companies now are doing real world testing, so to speak, to bring those skills up and to increase their diversity and employment. So COVID really has promoted a lot of change, not only in workplace flexibility, but really throughout everyday life.
Yep. Debra, are you frozen? Not a good time to freeze. I think she was about to ask a question. So Antonio, do you want to interject?
So Elaine, you mentioned that the foundation was providing technology for organizations, and they were able for them to be able to continue to work, and you identified that was a gap in digital skills that everyone is talking about. How do you see the fact that now those organizations, at least they have some resources, some tools, they have some technology available? How do you see how are they after COVID? Hopefully, it won't take too many months for us to be in a better position that we are today. How do you see that new skills and new capacity improving the way how they work and operate?
Well, I think hybrid, which is the key word, is here to stay. Before COVID, working from home or doing anything remotely for any part of your life sometimes was seen as accommodation, especially for people with disabilities, right? And we did an employment survey, Kessler Foundation National Employment Survey in 2017, and it talked with 3,000 supervisors in the US who supervised employees with and without disabilities. And at that point in time, accommodation was nice to have, and it was seen not on everybody's radar screen. But now if you look at it, accommodations has kind of leveled the playing field for people with disabilities, that they're able to work remotely. So I think, and we should say too that remote work isn't for everybody, but I think service delivery, what's happened in, at least where I am in New Jersey, if you serve one particular county or city, and you did that previously because you had to drive somewhere or get somebody or somebody had to come to you to see you for services. Now they're looking at a large, expansive geographic area where they didn't consider service delivery before. It's not limited to where you are. You can expand your services and hopefully reimburse for your services wherever you are located. So I think hybrid services are here to stay. Which also means there's greater support for technology and people working in their homes as well.
So commenting on that, I think it's clear that we might expect some improvement in terms of productivity considering that some of the accommodations were not there in the past, and once they are available, that would free people, or at least would allow a level of flexibility that they can that would allow them to better manage their own life and experience.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the flexibility is key. A more important question is that everybody starts returning to the office, who's going to be allowed to work at home? So right now, there's been a lot of accommodations and total flexibility. But I know, where we are, our CEO prefers everybody coming into the office. So, are people going to have to make and negotiate special arrangements to stay at home, or is it going to be included in company policy somehow that the hybrid workplace meets your needs? I know Harvard Business Review magazine just had a big article on that, and what they suggested is you can't make organizational decisions. For example, we think it's best that everybody works here. You need to talk to your employees and help have them in the decision making as to what your workplace is going to be looking at, because during COVID, company culture was totally blown apart. And because people are working remotely or you were shut down. And as companies rebuild culture, they really need to talk and think about, how are you going to include people with disabilities? How are you going to make a more inclusive culture? And have that diversity of all kinds of people that maybe were excluded from your workplace previously, or you didn't pay much attention to.
Absolutely. Certainly something that we're thinking about within our own organization. We've got a program looking at what comes next, because honestly, the old normal's never coming back.
Right.
Even with all of the inoculations and everything else, we're going to be living in a different kind of world, regardless. And then on top of that, you've got the technology. Of course, lots of us crave human-to-human contact, and lots of us want the ability to go into the office and socialize with people and all the rest of it. But at the same time, the likelihood is that most people aren't going to be in the office 100% of the time, and that the expectation of maybe the managers that you mentioned that like that are going to be mismatched with the expectations of the employees as they've got used to something different. Mm-hmm. So I think that resetting of managerial expectations has to happen, because they have to recognize that they can't put a lid back on flexible working, and nor should they.
Right.
But also, what we've been doing isn't really that flexible. It's hard work. Actually, we're working longer hours, spending more time in front of the screens, doing stuff that's less healthy than some of the practices we had before. So what we need to find is actually a new normal, a new hybrid, because we don't have it right now. What we have is something pretty horrible, actually. I mean, I worked from home for years before COVID, and it wasn't as intense as this. There were things that you could do in your time off that enabled you to decompress. Now, essentially, the only social contact most people have is through the screen at work. So that's intensified the sort of working relationship that people have, but it's also meant that a lot of people are burning out. It's creating mental health issues. We need to look at all of those kind of team dynamics, whilst at the same time recognizing that it's an opportunity to give the flexibility that's required for people that have long-term health conditions or lack of mobility to be able to do jobs that they couldn't do before. Debra, you're back. Do you have internet?
I do, sort of. I know, I see you laughing. It's so funny. I'm about to kill the United States for the lack of quality Wi-Fi we have, but I'm just shaking my head. So, but I'm able to listen. Sorry.
So let me throw a question to all of you. So how do you we have been talking about topics that relates with people within a company. So who should be driving this? Is this a new HR function? Do we need to completely rethink HR? Human resources doesn't seem to be the right word for a department that is supposed to manage all this. What are your views?
Well, I'll tell you, so we did in our 2017 supervisor survey that I mentioned, we saw that when you talked about diversity and inclusion, it had to come from the C-suite. It had to come from the top. And there's somebody named Randy Lewis in the United States that really started the first initiative for inclusion hiring at Walgreens, which is now Walgreens Boots. And, he says that you need not only clout, so you need to have power within the company, but you need to have a budget. And it has to come with somebody who can be a driver. And it's usually an advocate, a family ally, somebody who knows somebody with a disability, and they're able to put it through the company that this is what you have to do. And again, from the survey, we saw that, yes, there was perhaps CEO buy-in, but at the same time, the managers and supervisors had to buy in, and they bought in more actually, because their performance was tied into the performance of somebody with a disability. But, the overlay in all this is nothing's going to happen without metrics. So unless there's metrics on retention and hiring, perhaps return on investment, if you're in marketing products for people with disabilities, that becomes one of your goals. How are you going to have this in every level of your company? It's not just, it may be driven and started by CEO and then sent to HR to kind of execute, but unless there's buy-in throughout the company, it's really not going to happen. And that may happen just by a small group and division. When you're talking about change of culture, it could take 5 years.
Well, so I'm the person responsible for that within my own organization. So what can I say? So we do have executive sponsorship. So essentially we have a structured program now, we've done a lot of sort of top down, bottom up, sideways, influencing whichever way we could to get to the point where the CEO is fully bought in, the C-suite all supported, and in fact they've all got roles within it now. So we've got a structure, we've given them roles that they need to carry out. We've essentially we're following a similar kind of path to what we do for sustainability within the organization. So we've got all of the different parts of the business have different things that they can contribute to disability inclusion. And then that's all mapped out, and then we set them their targets and how we measure that, and then that starts to create this sort of groundswell. And also, yes, the provision of the assistive technologies and the provision of flexible working, that does help people be more productive. We've got stats on the money that we're spending, what that saves us in terms of absence, lost time, lost productivity, employee churn, all of these kind of things. It's really money well spent. The amount of money that we spend on assistive tech and making adjustments is a drop in the ocean compared to what we would spend if we were having to recruit people because they've because people have left, retrain people to replace the skills that we lose through some of this. So I agree with you. The executive C-suite sponsorship is really important, and getting them, the C-suite, talking amongst themselves and making that public commitment is also extremely important, because that then makes the people that are interested but didn't feel empowered feel comfortable coming out and doing more.
And I would just like to make one comment, and I know I have terrible Wi-Fi today, but I think a mistake. I like the way you're doing it at ATOS meal. I think it makes more sense. Often a problem that we have is that, and Randy Lewis is not a good example, but you have somebody like Randy Lewis very committed to this, and luckily once he left and retired, it continued. But sometimes when a company only has one person focused on it and then they leave, it goes away. So it's very important that it be embedded throughout the entire processes, like you're doing at Atos. But we continue to see companies fail if they're relying just on one executive and then that executive leaves. And I also do want to say, I think, I have a lot of hope for what Caroline Casey's doing with Valuable 500, with all those CEOs coming together. And I know you're on that board, Neil, which makes me, meaning Atos signed up for the Valuable 500.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I think you were very early on, right?
Yeah,
Doing it.
yeah,
So I
we
didn't
were-
call it a board. It's,
I
I don't know what
But
you
I would
call it.
also say, Deborah, to your point, I wasn't talking about one person in an
I agree.
organization.
No.
Right. I know you weren't. I know
right,
you weren't.
but-
I'm just
but I
saying
think-
some people do.
Right, but I'm thinking there has to be a leader who starts. That's all I'm saying. And then it kind of mushrooms from there, to your point, that it has to be more than one person, or else, we see that a lot of employment initiatives, a lot of organizations start things and they die. Why? Because there's not a lot of buy-in and there was only one leader and that was it.
Yeah, and sometimes the topic, we've seen this happening over the last 10 years, where diversity becomes a part of PR, and that's it, where chief diversity officers don't really have the capacity to implement, and then we see a lot of change in organizations, with people leaving the organizations because they were not able to make the change that they wanted.
Yeah, that's really critical too. So again, back to our survey, because it was really interesting. So this was all before COVID. And, when you ask companies if they were interested in diversity and inclusion, oh yeah, 69% or so. And then they said, okay, well, you're ready to do it. That was like 58%. And then if you go down to, well, are people with disabilities included in that? That was like 28%. So yeah, to your point, Antonio, when you actually try to get some commitment, that's where kind of the rubber meets the road, and that's the real test. So I think, the fact that Caroline Casey and the Valuable 500 makes people look from a board level, that this is an initiative that people are going to participate. That's taking it even higher than C-suite, if you will.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point, and actually we have to report our initiatives to our board, not just to the CEO. And it's really interesting to see how when you've got the oversight also encouraging the C-suite, that also has a reinforcing effect. And I'm really excited by the work that they're doing, but by bringing these business leaders together, because actually this is a shared endeavor. This isn't something that one company or one, someone wearing a cape can sort out. This is absolutely something that is a responsibility of all of us, but also something that we can collectively all contribute to. Right. So genuinely bringing the CEOs together, bringing the companies together, helps create a world which is more inclusive.
And Caroline is doing that well, talking at business forums.
Yes,
which is particularly important.
But to your earlier point, Neil, about COVID and mental health and working at home, that at least in the United States, and I don't know about worldwide, but that's the #1 disability. So if you're thinking about, whether or not you're working with corporate boards, C-suite, within companies, there are lots of people with a hidden disability of having some mental health. And if it wasn't before COVID, it may certainly be now, because it exacerbated a lot of people who were able to function very well before COVID, and to Neil's point, are now really having a hard time after, after a year being fairly isolated in most countries. It's very, very difficult. So, as we re-enter the workforce, and we've talked about this before, and Debra mentioned it, it's a time when, those in the know should really start reevaluating what their companies, divisions, even, if you can't do it, you may not have that influence, but certainly your own department, you may be able to look at, you have openings, who you're hiring, how you're caring for the people, how you're managing that small group of people. If that's the only thing that you have control over, that's fine, but if you spread the message of how well your team is working in, however way you're managing and supervising, you're sure to be noticed within your own company.
Yeah, I think that's really sage advice. And we've seen how actually doing stuff actually work. It's not being afraid to actually take that first step. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. Definitely something I live by. But that's also something that some of my colleagues live by as well, because all of our sort of diversity networks grew up pretty much organically. We had some support. Someone said it was a good idea, but then they mushroomed, and that's been due to people's enthusiasm and people taking stuff on themselves and really doing stuff. And we actually have an allies network now, which is brilliant, because actually it acts as the sort of the binding and the glue between all of these different groups, so that we don't end up with silos. And now that's been taken on by the whole of our organization. So what was people doing it within their own bit of their job then started to grow and mushroom and it spreads. So I hope that people feel empowered enough or brave enough to want to have a go, because for the most part, if you wait for someone to say yes, you'll be waiting a long time. It's not because they don't want you to do it, it's because there's a million and one other things going on, especially in today's situation, where I think if you're, you don't have those informal conversations anymore. You book a half-hour meeting, or you've got 300 different unread emails, or a slew of different messages. So I think some of that autonomous action is really, really important. How would, as a sort of closing thought, how would maybe Kessler look at providing resources or for people that want to do these things? Is that something that you would be able to teach people and encourage people that are the next generation of leaders of these kind of initiatives? Is that sound a bit like the work you were doing with
certainly
with
we
New
could
York?
do that through grant making, but mostly we see ourselves as connectors.
Yeah.
So we're kind of in that middle space between since we're the funder, I like to say, since we have money to give away, we're everybody's best friend. So we're kind of in the space between the people who can do it and NGOs. So we do like to connect people and provide resources, but actually at this point, we don't do any consulting ourselves. So, but we do get a lot of inquiries, to your point, Neil, about how to do different things, and we pass it along to the field. But we do bring people together through, virtual symposiums, through, we did do it in in-person meetings, small gatherings. So we see ourselves as a broker of information. I guess that would be the best way to describe it.
Yeah, excellent. And of course, Debra and I have had the great pleasure of being part of some of those virtual symposiums. Thank you so much for all of the insights today. I need to also thank My ClearText, Microlink, and Barclays Access for keeping us on air, keeping us captioned, and really look forward to you joining the conversation with us on Tuesday on Twitter. Thank you, Elaine.
Great.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be on.
You were amazing as usual. Amazing. We're proud of you as a leader in the U.S.
Oh, thank you.